Hello and good morning. My name is Amy DeBacker and I'm the project coordinator for Serving California's Diversity. This webinar, titled Japanese American Intergenerational Trauma and Cultural Resilience, Implications for Survivors and Victims of Crime, presented by Traci Ishigo, is produced by the Center for Innovation and Resources with funding provided by the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, made possible through the United States Department of Justice Victim Crimes Act. Before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. For those of you who can hear me, this might seem obvious, but I want to remind everyone to turn on their speakers in order to hear the presentation. Your audio is set to come through your computer, so please check to make sure your volume is turned up. Please note that there are two features to ask questions. Use the Q&A feature to ask the presenter any questions that you may have regarding the content. We will try to leave space at the end of the webinar to answer any questions you may have. There is a feature to ask questions anonymously. You must check the anonymous box on the Q&A feature. For any tech support questions, please ask those in the chat section. The chat panel is where you can ask these tech support questions and we will answer questions immediately in this panel. When sending a chat, please choose all panelists from the drop-down menu. And now I would like to welcome our presenter, Traci Ishigo. So 1 second here, let me pull this up. Traci Ishigo is our presenter, and they will be sharing about their experience as mixed-generation Japanese American, Buddhist, queer clinical social worker, therapist, community organizer in Little Tokyo, and co-director of the grassroots solidarity organization, Vigilant Love. So Traci, if you would like to go ahead and share your screen with us. And I'm going to unmute you as well. Okay. So you'll just want to unmute yourself, Traci. There we go. Okay, perfect. We're all good.
Okay, great. And does the screen look all right?
Yes, you are good to go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Amy, for inviting me to present on this topic. It's really an honor. And just a conversation that more of our Japanese American community is having, and one that I'm excited to reflect a little bit about with everybody here today. So good morning, everybody. I titled this a little bit differently because as I was pulling just like all of the information together, I just wanted to frame it around Japanese American intergenerational trauma, resistance, and resilience. And you'll get a sense of that through our presentation today. In this photo, what you'll see, if any of you are curious, is actually, this is from the 2017 Manzanar pilgrimage. And up here are three other of my co-founders of Vigilant Love. We're a grassroots organization that really comes out of a legacy of Japanese Americans and Muslim Americans building together after 9/11. So many of the elders from Kathy Masaoka, who is here on the far left holding the Japanese exclusion order sign, her generation had really led the way in building relationships with Muslim community that Vigilant Love is born out of. And so we have Seher Pirzada, my co-director, Tracy Kato Kiriyama, who's a longtime organizer and activist, and myself. And we're performing a rewrite of the civilian exclusion orders that were posted everywhere during World War II on the West Coast, instructing all persons of Japanese descent to follow the executive orders. And this was really a call to the thousands of people who had come to the Manzanar pilgrimage to really connect with our own story as Japanese Americans, everything that had happened, and really what is cyclical and what we're seeing in today's climate, our socio-political climate today. So that's what's in the background of these slides. So I wanted us to begin with a grounding, and this is a practice that I do as, you know, in the way that we hold space in Vigilant Love at the beginning of our meetings, our direct actions, our some of our main programs that we have, and just a practice that I have in teaching trauma-informed yoga and meditation. But really today, the intention of sharing a grounding for here is so that, you know, wherever you may be, that you can be right where you are and hopefully allow yourself to be fully present with what we'll be exploring with today. And so I invite you to just find a comfortable seat wherever you are. This could be at your chair, perhaps planting both feet on the ground, or if you're sitting in any other way that's comfortable for you. And then I invite you to perhaps sit up a little bit taller and maybe allowing yourself some space in the chest and in your belly to breathe. And perhaps you would like to just have a soft gaze out towards the screen. But I would also invite you to how it might feel for you this morning to gently close your eyes and just allow yourself these few breaths at the beginning of our presentation of our session today to just tune into how you're doing. So perhaps taking a full deep breath in through the nose and a slow exhale out. Taking another full deep breath in through the nose. I invite you to slow this next exhale down. And as you continue to find your breath, perhaps this morning, particularly with the theme that we're covering today, I invite us all to perhaps notice what a privilege it is to slow down, to breathe, perhaps noticing and recalling or remembering, imagining the moments that our ancestors before us have had time to breathe. Wherever your ancestors have come from, perhaps connecting with them for just a moment as some of the causes and conditions that have allowed you to just be exactly where you are for this presentation today. Taking in whatever we will explore in this next hour. Honoring all of their effort and energy, and all of yours as well. Perhaps taking another full deep breath in through the nose. And honoring on your exhale why you chose to connect with this session, this webinar today. Finding perhaps that curiosity that drew you in, your own sense of values as a person, and also the clients, the communities that you serve, that you want to serve. Just a connection with all of those things. I invite you to take one more full deep breath in through the nose of all of that. Exhaling out. Noticing your presence, your body, just where you are. And as you're ready, taking your time and perhaps gently opening up your eyes. And thank you all for joining me in that. I hope it was supportive for you too. So I'm going to move us along now. And I wanted to share a little bit of background about myself here. I come from, in the Japanese American community, we have different names for different generations that you come from. And so when the first word says yonsei, this means that I'm fourth generation. And I'm fourth generation on my dad's side. He was the third generation Japanese American whose family had immigrated here in the late 1800s, early 1900s to Hawaii. And that's where he was born and raised. And on my mother's side, I'm Shin Nisei, which means like new second generation immigrant. So my mom is a new immigrant, meaning that she immigrated here post World War II. Her family is from Hiroshima in Japan, and experienced what it was like to be at war with the United States and to be in Hiroshima during the war. And so for me, these are parts of my own experiences that inform a lot of my work as someone who is anti-racist, anti-oppression, and looking to find a way to channel and participate in our communities and society today. I'm also trained as a clinical social worker and a therapist in my work, and I think that this will hopefully come through in the conversation we're having about intergenerational trauma. But a large portion of my work is actually informed by being a community organizer. This is something that I feel so grateful for to be involved in. And I think particularly what I wanted to express in sharing about my background and perspective is that I'm a younger perspective. And it's coming from a community or systems oriented level, from a clinical perspective as well. And so this will be a lot of my particular framing to the work or to the presentation and information. This is also to not present any illusions that I'm a historian or that there is just so much important work out there about Japanese American history, and to really encourage all of you to have this be a moment where we explore, but to find other resources out there as well for more of that historical, really comprehensive perspective. And in this picture, you'll see some folks from Vigilant Love. Again, we're working to build solidarity amongst our communities of Japanese Americans, Muslim Americans, many others. And each year we have a Solidarity Arts Fellowship, which brings together young Muslim American, Japanese American, 18 to 24-year-olds. This is where we are at the Manzanar Pilgrimage last year. And some of my sources and inspiration for this presentation come from my personal and professional practice. When I say personal, I also mean a lot of the personal relationships and community. And so you'll see here some Sansei elders or aunties that I love dearly, who had showed up in protest with us at the Muslim ban, or when the Muslim ban, the first iteration was announced, and are reflecting that Japanese Americans are in solidarity with all Muslims, refugees, and immigrants. This also comes from some historical and theoretical studies that I found that are really illuminating on this topic, and our research that I had approached during my time in receiving or in earning my master's in social work. And so this is going to be some of the sources and inspiration of this talk. For an overview for what I'll be covering today, we're going to explore a history of trauma for the Issei, Nisei, and Sansei generations, so the first, second, and third generations. I also am particular that this is a history of trauma. This isn't a comprehensive history. meaning that there is actually such rich history for these generations. And it's not only fair to define them by the trauma that our community has experienced, but I will be focusing more on that today. Also, some of the intergenerational reverberations, and I put this in quotations because this is a word that I had recalled from some of the work that I've done with Sansei, Nisei generations as we reflect together in community about what it's like for younger generations or for folks who weren't directly in the camp experience. What was a word that could be felt to encompass the impact and reverberations as one that really came up a lot in terms of feeling that there's just been this wave or there's just been these reverberations that community has felt. I'll also be reviewing some community values that have really anchored the community in a sense of resilience and in carrying on, being present in the midst of adversity. And a lot of the resistance work that I think is indicative of the healing and again, the resistance or the resilience of the community. I'll close with some implications for practice, recommendations for what it might be like if you're working with someone of Japanese descent who may be a victim of crime, or perhaps you're a social worker serving them in whatever field that you are in, some notes about cultural competency when working with our community. And then we'll close hopefully with some Q&A. And so if you do have questions throughout the presentation, you're invited to write it down into the chat box and really take that opportunity to know that we'll make time for that at the end, hopefully. Okay. All right, so some of the themes that I'll be reflecting on for the history of trauma for the Issei, Nisei, and Sansei generations are around migration, hard labor, and exploitation, surveillance, informancy, and registries, forced evacuation, removal, family separation, incarceration, and re-entry and post-war anti-Japanese experiences. I had recently gone to Hawaii where I had visited the Japanese Cultural Institute of Hawaii. They have an amazing exhibit that shares more in depth about the migration and the experiences of Japanese people in Hawaii in particular. But I wanted to begin with this history because it's important context as we're thinking about this community, our community, through an intergenerational trauma lens. And so the Japanese American community really began in the late 1800s. Many Japanese immigrants had come over after being recruited to be farm workers in Hawaii's sugar plantations. And they were heavily recruited actually from the poorer areas of Japan, where these immigrants would be used to very hard labor. And that's because life on the sugar plantations was extremely hard. When first Japanese immigrants from the city had come, it was so difficult that they had returned back to Japan. And so it was a very hard life for immigrants who had decided to leave their homes and their families behind and come to the US or Hawaii at the time. In terms of some of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that the life was really long. They had 10-hour work days, 6 days a week. They had worked all year long, so no breaks. The conditions were hot, there was rain, it's humid, and it's dusty. And the plantations were controlled by lunas, which were people who had made sure that and used intimidation to make sure that the Japanese immigrants were being as productive as they could be with their whistles, with their whips. Many Japanese immigrants didn't necessarily understand everything that the lunas were saying, but could always sense it through these elements of control that the lunas had used. The women worked as well. Many had come over as picture brides, uncertain of the life that was held in Hawaii, then they did the same work, but they were paid less. And these are just some personal notes that I had collected from my time while I was at the cultural center. But I thought that I wanted to share this Hole Hole Bushi song here that Japanese immigrants had written. It shares that wonderful Hawaii, or so I heard. One look and it seems like hell. The manager's the devil and his lunas are the demons. Um, and to just reflect about how difficult life was for the Issei generation who had first come here. This is the same generation who was heavily surveilled and targeted as seeming to be un-American, dangerous. You'll see here on the left is a newspaper clipping, and it talks about how Japanese immigrants were alarming, that they were seen as potential spies, that they were seen as unassimilable, un-American, and in particular, these Japanese immigrants were watched in many different ways, depending on their expression of cultural practices. Later on down the line, if you were a Shinto or a Buddhist practicing, these were all indicators for why you would seem more dangerous potentially. And so what you can see here is just a level of white supremacy that was specifically targeting Japanese and immigrants for very like cultural, inherent spiritual elements of who they were. Many communities have their own cultural practices, have their own spiritual traditions that are really important to people in their sense of dignity of self, their sense of identity. And this relates to what many communities have to experience today. It relates really directly to the experiences of Muslim Americans around what it's like to live in a country where who you are is viewed as a national security threat. And therefore, civil liberties or privacy and so many other basic freedoms are coming into expense at your own personal well-being. So during the time, the U.S. Army of Office of Naval Intelligence, the FBI, they had commissioned surveillance and investigations of Buddhism and many other communities within the Japanese American community, like fishermen and individuals who were sharing Japanese language or teaching that. They had used informants years before Pearl Harbor to collect information in registries with hundreds of names. And so it's this level of historical context that I think is important in remembering that before Pearl Harbor had happened, because of hysteria and because of racism, there was already the groundworks being laid in terms of how community was being viewed as potentially dangerous, and registries were being set up for that. And because of all of that groundwork, we had seen after Pearl Harbor, 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor had happened, we had seen Executive Order 9066. There were arrests, communities experienced forced evacuation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, authorizing the removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast of the United States, despite or based on the rationale of military necessity and national security, despite no evidence of espionage or sabotage. And this was reflected in a lot of the surveillance that they had already done, that there was no evidence of such. And nonetheless, we had seen the incarceration of more than 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans who were indefinitely detained. causing helplessness and anxiety for families whose loved ones were first arrested and taken away. And I share that they're indefinitely detained because at the time that's what it had seemed as, though. People didn't know how long their loved ones or family members would be incarcerated or detained for. It ended up that the average duration of incarceration was around 2 to 4 years. And during that time, upon learning of the executive order, within a couple weeks, they had to sell or abandon all of their belongings and only bring with what they could have in a bag. So they had lost all of their hard-worked farmland, property, businesses, many temples, many of their precious family heirlooms and belongings, many items that for many of you, even in trying to do like the KonMari method, it's very difficult of like thinking about what am I going to get rid of, and not to make that comparison, but just to thinking about the value of all of these things that as people growing up, as people living their lives, you build an attachment to, and you ultimately have to say goodbye for no good reason under this country. And even in terms of family relationships, some family members in protest chose to leave the United States altogether. In the stories that I've heard from the community, there are many individuals whose families were split apart because of how Executive Order 9066 had landed with different individuals. There were many different responses. Some were to be willfully obedient because of a fear of what would happen if they were not. We had seen many, 3 individuals in particular, who had worked their way through their own court cases and the Supreme Court in filing around the injustice of the executive order. We had also seen community members volunteer themselves for the 442 to serve in the military in the United States. And we had also seen some family members be detained and taken away to one of the harsher incarceration camps during the war, called Tule Lake, because of the way that they answered a loyalty questionnaire. So there were so many elements in which family members were taken apart and broken apart, sent to different camps. And they had survived in these desolate, isolated camps, detention stations, and prison barracks, which many incarcerees had to build themselves, behind barbed wire, under armed watchtowers, refused of due process, their privacy, freedom. And during this time, they were largely unsupported by any other communities. There wasn't a sense of activism around why Japanese Americans shouldn't be put in camps. So the level of trauma there in terms of not feeling a sense of support from many communities during that time, and to feel so isolated and alone. And during that time, the community felt a high level of anxiety and panic around the fear of what would happen next. Many of their belongings were confiscated. People were uncertain about where their loved ones had gone for weeks, and what would happen to them upon their destinations. Some individuals had believed that perhaps wherever they were being taken to, they would be shot and killed. And when they had arrived to camp, there was more uncertainty and anxiety around a loyalty questionnaire that had asked, in particular, 2 very complex and difficult questions for the first, second generation. One was asking if they would serve in the US military, and the other one was asking if they would forswear their allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. And there was no explanation for what this loyalty questionnaire was going to be used for. But it caused a great fracture in the community, and this is where some of the intergenerational trauma is around the reasons and how differently community had tried to answer those questions. Um, and and just to move us along, you know, so much of, you know, on an emotional level, what community had experienced was grief and despair for everything they had lost. I began with that history of the hard life of Japanese immigrants, just to reflect all the struggle that community had to endure. You know, many of them later on had immigrated from Hawaii over to the West Coast, and or stayed in Hawaii, but really worked hard to move themselves out of what they were experiencing as, you know, the most recent immigrants being the highest exploited, low paid farm workers on the island. And so many of them had worked so hard to start to get into different professions, to eventually have their own farmland, to also uh, even open up their own businesses. Many community had done so. There's, you know, many people could think that opening your own business is a high risk. But there's an interesting level of security there because at least you have a job. And at least you have a job in a time where it's very hard to be Japanese or very hard to be an Asian immigrant because of the yellow peril and the fear, and all of the anti-Chinese and Asian sentiment that was happening during the time. So when the executive order happened, there was so much grief and despair for all that they had worked hard for and all that they had lost. You know, in the camps themselves, there, because of how severe camp life was, there were significant psychosocial stressors. And the indignity and the stress of the removal and incarceration was overwhelming. In some of the research, one Issei man had committed suicide after suffering from uncontrollable suffering or uncontrollable trembling, and who didn't want to bring shame to his daughter if they were seen together in camp. There was a higher level of suicide amongst the men in our community. And there is still so much that, you know, in terms of stories from camp that we're still gathering through oral histories, but many of them at this point are lost because the Issei generation have already passed away. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm here and I accidentally pressed something. Okay, so around the victimization and trauma, okay, so the victimization and trauma, I thought that this was a really important chart that summarized, you know, what PTSD symptoms look like, specifically under intentionally human designed traumas, meaning that these are traumas that are intentionally human designed by the state, in this case, to inflict an overwhelming sense of helplessness and control over a community. Some community members had seen a discordance due to violation of basic beliefs. They had perceived a vulnerability and loss of personal control. There was so much rage and anger, or dysphoria, depression, and grief. Shame and guilt are very prevalent themes in the community. There was a lot of self-blame and dysfunctional beliefs about perhaps this was our fault because we weren't being American enough. And there was a great deal of avoidance, fear and anxiety around the experiences that survivors had lived through in camp. And whenever returning back to those memories, there still is a high level of anxiety and rage and many difficult feelings that survivors feel oftentimes. And ultimately, there is that detachment that is experienced. There is also, in terms of, on a trauma level, a sense of isolation that is felt from other people, non-Japanese, sometimes other Japanese Americans. And it was also structurally created because after the war, some Japanese communities, it was like you couldn't be around more than 2 or 3 families who were of Japanese descent. So it split up the community even further. And during the war or after the war, in terms of reentry and the post-war discrimination that they were returning to, many Japanese Americans feared of returning home and leaving the camps because of what society and would be like upon their return. They did see a high level of hate incidents and discrimination. There were 19 reported shootings, and we can assume that there were many more. But just not reported, and acts of terrorism upon their return. And again, it was so much of the Issei generation who had to suffer the most, experiencing shame for their imprisonment, for not being at their old age and being unable to gain their livelihoods back, and to be able to find work. And so there was so much shame related to depending on their children that many did suffer from suicide, and many other kinds of mental health related issues and concerns. But what is a common experience for many Japanese American families is that the issei and the nisei, some of the younger sanseis who had survived the incarceration experience, is that they did not discuss what had happened in camp for decades. There was so much avoidance and detachment around the trauma-related stimuli, because of how overwhelming it is to try and organize in one's psyche around what had happened to them during that time. Let alone were there, culturally relevant social workers at that time, many of whom were just joining the field. And so there wasn't a lot of sense of support that on a clinical trauma-based level for the community. But there is a huge amount of ways that community did support each other, which I'll get into a little bit. But an overwhelming theme is the sense of silence, the self-blame, the belief that they should have been more American, forced assimilation in many ways of not teaching their children to speak Japanese or to carry on many cultural aspects of their community. And there were so many different concerns on a biopsychosocial level of increased disease risk, knowing that trauma relates so much to one's long-term longevity and health, a number of health disorders, also addiction that many of the Sansei generation had struggled with after camp. I wanted to reflect some stories of survivors, so I'm going to exit out of this screen and share over here some videos that I wanted to share with you from survivors themselves.
The way I respond is that outwardly it looks like we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, and the only minority that's been oppressed that's been able to do that. And but it's a distortion of the level of anxiety that underneath that, and the sacrifices that are part of the trauma to choose careers for safety rather than self-expression. And I think that's a huge loss, that rather than manifesting our greatest wishes or our greatest talents or skills, that those had to be conformed to. And maybe it's true for a lot of people, no matter what. But I think that what's wrapped around that is this level of anxiety that somehow, if you don't, like when I decided I wanted my actual birth name, Satsuki, instead of being called Sandy, my mother looked me straight in the eye and she said, "Bad things will happen if you do that." So that's what she transmitted to me, was that, if you don't create this image and do what you're told. And then I think as a therapist, I have met with enough Sansei clients to know that jobs taken, careers chosen, were at great sacrifice to what they would have loved to have done. And I think of the loss that our community and the rest of the world have suffered because of that. And then the level of anxiety. So lots of anxiety, depression. It's like anxiety and depression are one side or the other of the same mental health issue. And then anxiety often shows up as being driven. And being driven in America is a good thing, is seen as, good high achievers. But there's a great physiological cost to that and mental cost to that too.
And here is another video.
When, we started going back to school, I entered the 5th grade and we were welcomed. My teacher in kindergarten was now the principal of the school, and she really welcomed me. And so I really feel I was lucky and I was fortunate. School was easy for me when I returned. But I will admit that when people found out that I had been in a prison camp and they would ask me about it, I just didn't talk about it. And I wouldn't talk about it. It was something that was so negative, the idea of being sent away and the idea of not being American, that idea that the government felt toward the Japanese Americans. I didn't want to talk about it. So I didn't. I just kept quiet. People say, and I'd say, well, it wasn't so bad. And that was it. I would not talk about it. It's hard.
And that last part that she had shared around not talking about it.
My dad was Issei. So
is a common experience because of, for many trauma survivors, there's one experience is minimizing what you had experienced when you're not ready to talk about it. When there isn't a sense of safety to be able to talk about your experiences. And this is still so true for so many community members who haven't had an opportunity to learn from their elders, to learn from their parents or their grandparents. There are some who are very fortunate who have engaged in a lot of their own healing and are able to be very forthcoming and prepared and ready to explore their experiences. But a large number of our community have just not talked about their experiences. So when we reflect about the sense of intergenerational trauma that has taken place, there is so much more research that's needed about the intergenerational trauma impacts. But a statistic that I thought was interesting was that survey data reflects beliefs from Sansei with formerly incarcerated parents. So either one or both reported having less confidence that their rights would not be violated. And 44% of Sansei with both parents in camps agreed that a future incarceration of Japanese Americans could happen. And when I read that, I thought that the 44% of Sansei believing that future incarceration of Japanese American could happen, I found that to be quite high. It was surprising to me in many ways. And yet there is a deep understanding for, and a common belief for the community, I would say, that incarceration could happen again. And it can happen again to many other communities. It is happening again to many other communities. And this is coming from that place of knowing and feeling deeply about the impacts of camp on our community. But overall, there is a huge need for more research about the intergenerational impacts. Just in reflecting about what happens for individuals when there's unresolved trauma, is that it can manifest in a number of ways. And so this has looked like anger, abuse, addiction, a sense of emotional detachment, or a sense of emotional dysregulation, particularly around upsetting or trauma-related stimuli, a sense of hopelessness, desperation, or depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, meaning that there is a fear, a concern, being easily startled by anything that's going to be related to the trauma, and chronic worry are all very common. Chronic worry, this last part, I would say, is very common in terms of knowing what it was like to work so hard, lose so much, and experience such hardship. Chronic worry can be passed down just as a behavioral pattern from parents to children from the Japanese community. And as we've been discussing, that there's been a silence around the community's experience. This can lead to a lack of self-understanding and of identity of who they are as people, a loss of self in terms of a loss of being able to speak one's language, to know about one's own cultural traditions from a decolonized or a different a perspective that is true and unimpacted by the forced assimilation of white supremacy, and a sense of familial distance because of all of this. When you're not passing on your traditions, your culture, your identity in a way that is proud, and you're transmitting to the next generation a sense of that your identity is something that is problematic, that can be seen as dangerous, that can be seen as un-American, and therefore is a risk, what you're causing is a sense of great disconnection from generation to generation in terms of who they are, who for the elders are, and who the young people should be. And that creates a great deal of family distance. And this is why the redress and reparations movement, led by the Sansei generation, is so significant. And to enter into this history, Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress was a national coalition during the 80s who organized together for a 10-year campaign, which led to the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. This is 40 years after the war, when the government had, because of receiving constant grassroots political pressure, they had agreed to giving a formal apology from the government and provided reparations of $20,000 to surviving incarcerees. So this does not include the families of descendants whose family members who had survived the camp experience had already passed away. This does not include any of them. NCRR had held numerous meetings and organized survivors to bravely speak about their experiences, many for the first time. And this is why it was so significant to be held in such an empowering space of why should we remember? We should remember because we deserve our civil rights and our redress as a community. And they actually testified, hundreds of them testified to the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And today, I think that resilience and resistance looks like a lot of community members transmuting their trauma through remembering and activating solidarity. These are some groups that I wanted to lift up in terms of groups that are really working from a place of remembering, of excavating their history, of learning more about who they are, who we are, and their responsibility for solidarity. And so Nikkei Progressives emerged after the Trump administration, works locally in Los Angeles. There are other, similar organizations in other states in the US, but looking to be a grassroots multi-generational space that shows up with other communities, whether it be Muslims or immigrants. And the Day of Remembrance is an annual program that's held in cities across the United States on February 19th to observe the signing of Executive Order 906. And as a previous organizer of Day of Remembrances, it was such a valuable experience where elders and young people were building together to hold a program that would honor the experiences of the Issei and the Nisei, and also draw connections to issues today and our responsibility as Japanese Americans to remember for the purpose of being able to show up in our activism and in the many ways that Japanese Americans can show support for communities. Sudo for Solidarity is a nonviolent direct action project of Japanese American social justice advocates working to end detention sites and support frontline immigration and refugee communities that are being targeted by racist, inhumane immigration policies. This is a national group that is working to hold a direct action, the largest one at the White House. So you can look them further up there. And then my organization, Vigilant Love, we're again building upon that legacy of Muslim Americans and Japanese Americans building relationships together post 9/11, realizing that during the time, back during World War II, Japanese Americans didn't have other allies, didn't have a sense of support from the larger community to reaffirm that what they were going through was inhumane and unjust. And so Vigilant Love is really intentional about creating spaces for such connection, resisting that insularity or a narrative of insularity, and organizing grassroots movement to ensure the safety and justice of communities impacted by Islamophobia and violence. We do so largely through an arts and healing driven lens. And a lot of our work right now is focused upon countering or resisting Islamophobic policies. I'm going to pick it up here because I realize that we're running out of time. But I wanted to remember Nikkei cultural values and resilience throughout everything that I had just covered. There are some cultural values that have been really important for the Japanese American community to be so resilient as they were. Two of them in particular that are commonly discussed and reflected upon, sometimes with reverence and sometimes with resentment, are gaman and shikataganai. And gaman is a sense of quiet endurance, persevering through hardship. You would just see it reflected so culturally in so many Japanese Americans who had gone through the World War II experience, but even in reflecting upon my own father who hadn't himself, that quiet endurance and perseverance through hardship is a cultural value that has been passed down across generations. And another one was shikataganai, a sense that it can't be helped. So it's a sense of acceptance, but with resignation to the injustice or the oppression that they had endured. And for many individuals, this is the one where it's more complicated because there are different beliefs that of self-criticism that could arise. Well, if we didn't have a sense of shikata ganai, would there have been more of, how could you just go into the camps? There is some of that discussion, but if we were to see it from a strengths-based lens, we can also understand that shikata ganai is a sense of being able to face the challenge head on, to face life just as it is, and to still be present with your life in many different ways, in building community and trying to preserve family as best as they can in the camps. And so there are a number of other, cultural values to lift up that I've listed here that, people from Japanese descent especially can reflect upon. What does this look like for my family? And how did this translate into the way that they survived and were resilient through the camp experience? And, there's just so much collectivity and creativity that community members have reflected in camp. Community had began Japanese gardens, created artwork, constructed furniture, did flower arrangement, calligraphy, wood carving, had baseball leagues, dances, games, and much more to try to make life better, or as best as it could be in the camps. And this is why some people will reflect, especially younger survivors, will reflect like, oh, camp wasn't so bad. It was actually fun. And it's because there's a focus on the good parts that community was able to preserve for their lives while being in a prison camp. And just a comment around, what it looks like in remembering Nikkei cultural values and resilience today. We see so much resilience in terms of a reclaiming of culture, finding a new sense of pride in being Japanese American and in preserving traditions. And this is seen through Obon festivals, which are summer festivals, Buddhist festivals, remembering the ancestors or those who have passed away in the previous years, that happen across many cities, a number of cultural programs, a continuation of spiritual communities from both Buddhist and also Christian faith backgrounds, a number of Japanese American institutions who are preserving the history, preserving Japantowns, and a large amount of community organizing and emergence of new projects that are honoring history, culture, and identity of the community. And all to say that when working with Nikkei community today, some elements that are going to be so important for you all is to be practicing cultural competency, and this means having a sense of education. So this was just a very brief overview, and I really wasn't able to go very deep. But to continue a sense of education about the history, to have a sense of self-awareness about who you are, your identities, your positionality, your privileges, even your own sense of historical oppression, and to really practice cultural humility. And so by me reflecting about the different cultural, themes, to still have a sense of humility and curiosity about what that might look like from Japanese American to Japanese American, it will look very different. And to always restore safety, agency, a sense of choice, to reaffirm the dignity that survivors of crime or victims of crime have experienced, and to inform individuals about their options, but to place no judgment around however Japanese survivors of crime may proceed in whatever they choose is best for them. And to really just invite and explore, and invite their own remembrance and reconnection to who they are, perhaps, if that feels right in the work that you're doing with them. I totally ran us to the end of the time, and I apologize for that. But at this time, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to share about this topic, and I'll pass it over back to Amy.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And so at this moment, we will be ending the webinar. We do have Tracy's email on there. So if you do have any questions, you could go ahead and send her an email, or you can connect with myself or CIR and we can forward your questions. Thank you so much for your participation, and please fill out the survey at the end, and have a great day, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.